It was, I recall, one of those perfect English afternoons that make one forgive the climate all its treacheries. The lawns of Hartington Court, that fine Georgian house in Surrey, lay in green terraces under a sky faintly veiled with cloud, like a lady preserving her complexion under a parasol. There were striped awnings and little white tables, and footmen who moved, silent and grave, with jugs of iced Pimm's and tinkling glasses. Somewhere a gramophone was playing a foxtrot with an air of slightly shocked determination, as though the country was still not quite sure how it felt about the jazz age. I had been looking forward to the garden party exceedingly. Lady Hartington, who was one of those energetic, well-meaning society hostesses whom one meets inevitably in England, had sent us a most cordial invitation. Myself and my old friend Hercule Poirot. At the time the affair occurred, I was staying with Poirot for a few days in his comfortable London flat. Lady Hartington, whose nephew I had once tended in a minor wartime operation, had written to suggest that I might bring your celebrated little Belgian friend down to Surrey to lend an air of distinction to her annual fete. I confess that I was pleased by the idea of seeing Poirot once again among the great and the gilded. There is something, I've always thought, particularly amusing in observing my friend's punctilious habits set against the relaxed, aristocratic chaos of an English country house. "Eh bien, Hastings," said Poirot when I showed him the letter, "our Lady Hartington flatters herself that she will lend us distinction, not the reverse. Observe the tact with which she places herself in the position of patroness, n'est-ce pas? Your celebrated little Belgian friend, as though I were some performing dog to be exhibited on a velvet cushion." "You cannot deny that you are a draw," I returned, "and you must own, Poirot, that a day in the country will do you good." Poirot regarded me with mild reproach. "The country," he ejaculated. "Always your English obsession with the grass and the mud and the insects. What there is in the country that is preferable to a well-kept London pavement, I cannot conceive. However," he shrugged his shoulders in the Gallic manner he sometimes affected, "Lady Hartington is an amiable woman. There will be tea and there will be order, after a fashion. And where there are many people, Hastings, there are always the possibilities of drama. Yes, we will go." The arrival at Hartington Court. We motored down after luncheon, arriving to find Hartington Court in all its summer splendor. It was a handsome house of red brick with tall chimneys and white stone pediments. The gravel sweep was filled with cars, the noise of conversation and laughter drifted from the gardens beyond. Lady Hartington herself came forward to greet us on the terrace, a thin, high-colored woman in a hat that reminded me irresistibly of a marching band plume. "Captain Hastings, so good of you to come. And Monsieur Poirot, I am enchanted. Everyone has been simply agog since I told them you were coming. You must let me introduce you to them all. We're quite a little colony this weekend." She rattled on, as hostesses will, but I was observing Poirot. I know his prejudices about country house parties. They offend his passion for regularity, and I was curious to see how he would endure the assault of introductions. Yet he bore it very well. His grey-green eyes rested thoughtfully on each person as they were named, and I fancied that his little bow to each had in it a shade of difference. "My daughter-in-law Evelyn," said Lady Hartington, drawing forward a woman in white. "Evelyn Marchmont, widowed, poor dear, last year. Evelyn, this is the famous Monsieur Poirot. Do be nice to him. You know how shy foreigners are." The introduction to Evelyn Marchmont. If Lady Hartington's last remark was in doubtful taste, it was also wildly inaccurate. I have never known anyone less shy than Poirot. But my attention, at that moment, was arrested by Evelyn Marchmont herself. She was not conventionally beautiful. Her features were a little too strong, the chin a trifle too decided, the nose just short of aquiline. But the total effect, framed in dark, lustrous hair drawn simply back, was very striking indeed. She had that peculiar poise which is not youth and not exactly maturity. a composure which suggests that a woman has been tested by life and not found wanting. Her eyes, of a deep hazel, glanced quickly at Poirot, at once appraising and detached. "Of course, I know Monsieur Poirot by reputation," she said. Her voice was low and singularly pleasant. "We are very honored to have you at Hartington. It makes our little party seem quite eventful." Poirot's head inclined an infinitesimal degree. "Madame Marchmont, the honor is mine. It is always an event to meet a lady whose name one knows already." I stared at him. "Do you know my name, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, with a faint smile. I am flattered and a little alarmed. "I have seen it," said Poirot, "in the newspapers." A shadow, it seemed to me, passed for a moment over her composed face. "The newspapers," she repeated. "Yes, they have been kind enough to take an interest in my private affairs." "That is the privilege of the press," murmured Poirot. "They render public what ought to remain private, and they pass over in silence the things that should most certainly be made known. It is the reverse of logic." The gathering of suspects. Lady Hartington, who detested allusions to anything disagreeable, intervened hastily. Now, we are not going to talk about newspapers," she cried. "Monsieur Poirot, you must meet the rest of our little company. Evelyn, do look after Captain Hastings and see that he is given something cooling to drink. You detectives must not be allowed to expire on my lawns." With that, she whisked Poirot away like a conjurer, producing and vanishing handkerchiefs, and I found myself left with Mrs. Marchmont. "You mustn't mind my mother-in-law," she said, watching Lady Hartington's retreating feathers with a trace of amusement. "She lives in terror that anyone may be bored for a single moment, and so she bores herself to death to prevent it." I laughed. "She is very kind, and for my part, I am prepared to allow her any extravagance in return for bringing me down here. It is a most beautiful place, Mrs. Marchmont." "Yes, it is," she agreed with a curious note in her voice. "Almost too beautiful." We strolled a little way along the terrace. Below us, the gardens spread out in orderly profusion. Rose beds, herbaceous borders, a yew hedge cut into fantastic shapes. There were groups of guests, whiteness of frocks and flashes of color against the smooth lawns. I could see Poirot already at work, politely bowing to everyone. To me, his small figure always had a touch of the theatrical against such backgrounds. "Have you known Lady Hartington long?" I asked. "For nearly 5 years," she replied. "Since I married her younger son. Geoffrey was in the diplomatic service." She paused. "But of course, you must have heard all that from her." "In outline only," I admitted. "Your husband died abroad, I believe, in some unfortunate circumstances." Her lips tightened. "In Constantinople. There was an accident, so they called it." She looked away. "Forgive me, Captain Hastings. One does not discuss these things with total strangers on sunny lawns. It makes the contrast too absurd." The web of relationships. "I'm sorry," I said awkwardly. "I should not have asked." "On the contrary," she returned, with a return of her faint, ironic smile. "I prefer the direct question. Most people prefer to pretend they know nothing, whereas, of course, they know everything, or think they do. You have read the account in the newspapers, naturally." "I remember something," I confessed. "There was a disagreement about the cause of death, was there not?" "One might put it so," said Evelyn Marchmont. "The embassy described it as an unfortunate fall on a staircase. A few journalists with more imagination than discretion preferred a more lurid version. And you see," she made a little gesture, "here I am, in my mother-in-law's garden, properly attired and carrying my widowhood like an ornament. One must go on, mustn't one?" I had no immediate reply to this oddly bitter remark. Before I could frame one, a tall, fair young man joined us, moving with the quick, impatient stride of one who finds leisure slightly wearisome. "Evelyn, my dear, you are neglecting your duties as hostess," he said. "Mother has been looking everywhere for you." She insists that you pour out for the vicar's wife as a mark of special favor. You know how she adores her petty hierarchies." Evelyn turned to him. "Rupert, this is Captain Hastings, an old friend of Monsieur Poirot. Captain Hastings, this is my brother-in-law, Rupert Hartington." We shook hands. Rupert had the pleasant, well-bred manner of the English upper class, but there was something restless about him, a flicker of dissatisfaction in the eyes. "You must help us keep Monsieur Poirot amused," he said. "If he finds Hartington Court tedious, we shall never hear the end of it from my mother." "I fancy Poirot will amuse himself," I answered, smiling. "He always does." "Then we must endeavor not to provide him with too much material," said Evelyn lightly. "You know what detective stories always say, Captain Hastings. A country house party, with all its opportunities for jealousies and quarrels. One would not wish to be vulgar." The scholar in the shadows. They moved off together. I hesitated a moment, debating whether to follow, then turned in the direction indicated for refreshments. It was at the corner of the terrace, near a stone balustrade set with urns, that I almost collided with a man who seemed to be emerging from the house rather hastily. He stopped short and muttered an apology. He was a curious contrast to the rest of the company, tall, dark, with the slightly stooping shoulders and abstracted air of the scholar. His clothes were well cut but negligently worn. His tie had slipped, and there was a smear of ink on one cuff. "So sorry," he said. "I was, wool gathering." "Not at all," I assured him. "Crowded place, these parties." "Yes. Ghastly, isn't it?" He gave me an apologetic smile. "Duncan Avery. I'm here under sufferance in a sort of semi-professional capacity. Lady Hartington insists I pretend to enjoy myself in between bouts in the library." "Are you a secretary?" I asked. "Historian," he corrected with a touch of pride. "Lady Hartington engaged me to write a history of the Hartington family and the house. There are trunks of letters and diaries that no one has touched for decades. Quite a treasure trove. I escape to them whenever I can. They don't require small talk." He glanced across the lawn. "I see you are a friend of Monsieur Poirot's. Fascinating man. I have read about him, of course. It will be interesting to see whether he finds our little microcosm as enthralling as the major crimes of Europe." "You speak as though you expect a crime," I said, amused. "In any group of human beings," replied Duncan Avery, "there are crimes. They are not all punishable by law, that is all. Oh, forgive me, that sounded idiotic. Too much time with 18th-century diarists makes one sententious." Poirot's observations. I found Poirot some 20 minutes later, seated under a lime tree with a cup of tea, listening gravely to an elderly clergyman who was discoursing on rural depopulation. His neat figure, in his usual immaculate grey, looked oddly at home amidst the rustic surroundings, as though they had been tidied up expressly to receive him. "Ah, mon ami," he said when I approached, seizing the first pause in the vicar's monologue. "You have," rejoined the flock. "Monsieur le Vicaire has been giving me a most interesting exposition of the moral decay of the countryside. It appears that the young people will dance, the old people will drink, and between them I do not know what will become of England." The vicar, a pink-faced man with mild blue eyes, chuckled indulgently. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot is laughing at me," he said. "But he is a foreigner, you see, Captain Hastings. He cannot know the English village as I do." "I assure you I do but admire your zeal," said Poirot with one of his charming bows. "If all the world had its vicar, it would be a better ordered place. But you will excuse us now. I must confer with my friend upon matters of most high importance." He led me away a little distance, under pretense of examining the roses. "You have observed, Hastings, our fellow guests?" he asked quietly. "A little," I admitted. "I have met Mrs. Marchmont, Rupert Hartington, and a man named Duncan Avery." "Tiens," Poirot's eyes brightened. "Already you are more advanced than I. Lady Hartington, quelle femme celle-là. has swept me from one person to another, but she has not yet allowed me to converse with any at leisure except the excellent vicar. Tell me, what is your impression of Madame Marchmont?" I hesitated. "She is interesting," I said at last. "Not at all like a conventional society widow. She seems, how shall I put it, as though she were slightly at odds with her surroundings." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Très bien. You have the perception, Hastings. And what do you know of her history?" "Very little. Only that her husband died abroad in what appears to have been, well, an accident that might not have been entirely accidental." "Just so. And that she has been in the newspapers." Poirot's voice was thoughtful. "You perceive that I too have read the newspapers. The affair Marchmont, does that not sound like a title for a Roman policier? The charming husband in the diplomatic service, the beautiful wife, the whispers of jealousy, of possible treachery, the fall on the marble staircase. Ah, the English are very delicate when it comes to scandal. They print enough to excite curiosity and never enough to satisfy it. The crime unfolds." At that moment, Lady Hartington bore down upon us once more. "Now, Monsieur Poirot, you must not be allowed to skulk in corners with Captain Hastings," she cried. "You are our guest of honor. I insist on your making yourself agreeable. Come, I want to introduce you to Sir Alistair Brooke. He's something in the Foreign Office, and he is simply dying to meet you." "But certainly, madame," said Poirot with his unfailing courtesy. "I come." It was, I think, about half an hour later that the peace of the summer afternoon was broken. I had wandered as far as the lower garden, where there was a small ornamental pond and a stone bench half hidden under overhanging shrubs. The sound of voices from the main lawn came faintly, softened by distance. I was enjoying a few minutes of solitary laziness when a cry rang out, thin but piercing, from the direction of the house. It was a woman's cry, high and shrill and filled with a kind of incredulous horror. For a second I did not move. The human mind, confronted with the unexpected, often clings absurdly to the hope that it has been mistaken, that what it has heard is no more than some trivial exclamation. But the cry was repeated, louder, more definitely. "Help! Oh, help! Someone! Please!" I sprang to my feet and started running up the path. From other directions I saw figures materializing, a footman, white-faced, two women clutching at each other. Rupert Hartington, already racing at full speed. As we converged on the terrace steps, I nearly collided with Poirot, who was coming from the opposite direction with an odd expression on his face, as though he had heard the cry and known in advance what it meant. The discovery. The cries were coming now from the house itself, from the long French windows that led from the terrace into the drawing-room. They were open, and framed in them I saw the figure of a maid, her apron askew, her hands pressed to her mouth. "What is it, girl?" demanded Lady Hartington sharply, pushing past us. "Mary, what on earth is the matter?" The maid lowered her hands. Her face, beneath its cap, was ghastly. It's Mrs. Marchmont, my lady," she stammered. "In the blue sitting-room. Oh, my lady, she's—" Her voice failed. Lady Hartington turned very white, but her commanding nature asserted itself. "Rupert, go at once," she said. "Captain Hastings, you are a doctor, are you not? Please—" We hurried through the hall, led by the stumbling maid. The blue sitting-room was a small, charming apartment on the ground floor, with French windows opening onto a side lawn. As we entered, I smelt at once that faint metallic tang in the air which is never to be mistaken. Evelyn Marchmont lay on the Aubusson carpet, a little to one side of the writing table. She was on her back, one arm flung out, the other doubled under her, as though she had half turned in falling. Her white frock was stained with a vivid patch of red over the left breast. For a moment I stood quite still, the professional instinct taking over. Then I knelt beside her, seeking a pulse, testing for any sign of breath. The wound was small and neat, just below the collarbone, a pistol shot from the look of it, fired at fairly close range. I do not know how long I knelt there. It cannot in reality have been more than a minute or two. Then, very quietly, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. "It is useless, Hastings." Poirot's voice was grave. "Quite useless," I said, and rose to my feet. "She is dead." The investigation begins. Lady Hartington had come into the room, clinging to the door frame with Rupert just behind her. Rupert gave a sort of strangled exclamation and took an involuntary step forward, but Poirot raised a restraining hand. "You will not touch anything, if you please," he said. "It is better that nothing is disturbed until the police arrive." "The police?" Lady Hartington repeated faintly. "But Evelyn—" "Oh, my God!" She swayed, and Rupert sprang to catch her. "Take my mother out, somebody," he said hoarsely. "She must not see like this." Between us, we half led, half carried Lady Hartington into the hall, where the vicar's wife, all flustered solicitude, took charge of her. A small crowd had already gathered, guests whispering, servants peering wide-eyed from doorways. There is nothing so irresistible to human curiosity as the scent of tragedy. Poirot raised his hand. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said with quiet authority, "I must ask you to remain in the drawing-room for the present. There has been an accident." "Accident!" cried Duncan Avery, who was at the front of the cluster. His sallow face was oddly strained. "You call that? We do not yet know what to call it, Monsieur Avery," said Poirot sharply. "It is not for us to make the declarations. Monsieur Rupert, the nearest police station. Where is it?" As I departed to summon the authorities, one thought lingered in my mind with disturbing persistence. Hercule Poirot, in that first moment in the blue sitting-room, had not looked surprised. He had looked, I realized, very much as a man might look who sees something he has, in his own mind, been expecting. And when I remembered that the something was the violent death of Evelyn Marchmont, the woman whose name, as he had said, he had seen already in the newspapers, a faint, disquieting question stirred in my mind. What, precisely, had Poirot expected when he came down to Lady Hartington's garden party? And how long had he known that the woman who lay dead in the blue sitting-room might not be permitted to remain quietly among the living? The woman who didn't stay dead had, indeed, found her final rest, but under circumstances that would require all of Poirot's considerable powers to unravel. The local constabulary arrived with commendable efficiency, led by Inspector Graves, a solid, sandy-haired man whose patient manner suggested long experience with the inexplicable nature of violent death. He surveyed the blue sitting-room with the methodical gaze of one who had seen too many such scenes, his eyes moving from the still figure on the carpet to the open French windows, taking in every detail with professional thoroughness. "Inspector Graves, Surrey Constabulary," he announced, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I understand we have Monsieur Hercule Poirot among our witnesses. I've heard of your reputation, sir, though I trust you'll allow me to conduct this investigation in my own fashion." Poirot inclined his head graciously. "But naturally, Inspector. I'm here merely as a guest who has witnessed tragedy, though perhaps my friend Captain Hastings, with his medical knowledge, might be permitted to assist?" Graves nodded curtly, then knelt beside Evelyn Marchmont's body. His examination was swift but thorough. "Shot through the heart at close range," he muttered. "Small caliber weapon, I'd say. No sign of the pistol, naturally." He rose, brushing dust from his knees. "The French windows were found in this position?" "Exactly as you see them," I confirmed. "One slightly ajar, the other closed." "Anyone could have entered from the garden," Graves observed, testing the window catch. "This side lawn is screened by shrubs, relatively private. Was the party in full swing at the time of the incident?" "Most guests were on the main terrace," said Poirot quietly. "This room, it would be quite isolated. One could come and go without observation." While Graves continued his examination, I watched Poirot move about the room with his characteristic precision. His eyes missed nothing. The position of the overturned chair, the neat arrangement of personal items on the writing table, the single teacup on the side table. He paused before the desk, his head tilted thoughtfully. "You observe something, Monsieur Poirot?" Graves asked, with the faint wariness of a professional faced with an amateur's theories. "The psychology of the scene, Inspector," Poirot replied softly. "It speaks, if one knows how to listen. See how the chair is positioned, not pushed back as one rising in alarm, but turned aside, as though the occupant intended to return. The pen lies uncapped beside the inkwell. This was not a woman preparing to die, but one interrupted in the act of writing." Graves frowned. "Writing what?" "Ah, that is the question." Poirot moved closer to the blotter, careful not to disturb anything. "With your permission, Inspector." At Graves' grudging nod, Poirot lifted the corner of the blotter with his handkerchief. Beneath lay a sheet of notepaper bearing the faint impressions of recent writing. "A letter," he announced quietly. "A letter that someone did not wish Madame Marchmont to complete." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Graves made a note, then turned toward the door. "We'll need to question everyone systematically. Time of death, Doctor?" "Between 4:30 and 5 o'clock, I estimated. Rigor had not yet set in when we found her." In the drawing room, the atmosphere was thick with tension and whispered speculation. Lady Hartington sat pale and shaken on the sofa, while Rupert Hartington stood rigidly by the fireplace, his face a mask of controlled grief. Duncan Avery hunched in a corner chair, his scholarly composure entirely abandoned. The other guests clustered in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Graves began with the maid who had discovered the body. Mary, still clutching her damp handkerchief, recounted her story in halting phrases, bringing the tea tray, hearing a thud from the garden side, finding the terrible scene. She had heard no gunshot, only that single sound like something heavy falling. "And when did you last see Mrs. Marchmont alive?" Graves asked gently. "About 4:30, sir. She came in from the garden, said she'd be wanting her letters when the second post arrived." "Did you bring them?" "No, sir. Mrs. Green said to wait until after the big trays were taken out. There was so much to do with the party and all." Poirot, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "The letters, Inspector. They would be important to establish what correspondence Madame Marchmont expected. Perhaps something urgent enough to draw her away from her guests." Graves nodded. "We'll examine her mail. Now then, I'll need to speak with each of you individually about your movements this afternoon. Lady Hartington, perhaps we might begin with you." As the questioning began, I noticed Poirot withdraw slightly, his green eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face. He was not listening merely to the words being spoken, but to the silences between them, the hesitations, the careful phrases that revealed as much as they concealed. Already, I could see, his remarkable mind was beginning to sort and categorize the human elements of this puzzle, seeking the psychological truth that lay beneath the surface of polite society. The woman who didn't stay dead had left behind more than a mystery. She had left a web of relationships, secrets, and motives that would require all of Poirot's considerable powers to unravel. Inspector Graves established his temporary headquarters in the morning room, a cheerful space with yellow chintz and tall windows that seemed to mock the gravity of the proceedings. A uniformed constable stood ready with his notebook, while Poirot and I were permitted to observe from chairs positioned discreetly near the window. The first to be questioned was Rupert Hartington, who entered with the stiff-backed bearing of a man preparing for an unpleasant duty. He took the offered chair with visible reluctance, his hands gripping the armrests as though anchoring himself against an expected storm. "Mr. Hartington," Graves began in his methodical way, "I need you to account for your movements this afternoon, particularly between 4 o'clock and the discovery of the body." "I was with the guests continuously," Rupert replied, his voice carefully controlled. "Helping Mother with introductions, ensuring everyone had refreshments. I spoke with several people. Sir Alistair Brooke about some Foreign Office matters near the Rose Garden, the vicar and his wife about the Church Restoration Fund. Anyone can confirm my presence. And your relationship with Mrs. Marchmont. A muscle twitched in Rupert's jaw. We were family. Civil, if not particularly close. Geoffrey and I were very different men, and Evelyn, well, she had strong opinions about how things should be managed after his death. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. Strong opinions, monsieur. Financial matters, Rupert said curtly. Evelyn felt entitled to complete independence in her affairs. I thought she should consider remarrying, for her own security, you understand. We disagreed. But surely you're not suggesting that a family dispute over money could lead to... He broke off, colour rising in his cheeks. We suggest nothing at present, Graves said mildly. When did you last see Mrs. Marchmont alive? Around 4:15. She was speaking with Avery by the yew hedge, then said something about needing to write an urgent letter. That was the last time I saw her. When Rupert was dismissed, Duncan Avery entered, his scholarly composure entirely shattered. His hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the coolness of the room. Mr. Avery, said Graves, I understand you are working in the library during the party. Yes, that is, I was supposed to be. Avery's voice cracked slightly, but I found it difficult to concentrate with all the noise. I stepped out for some air around 4 o'clock. Where did you walk? The side garden, the one that borders the blue sitting room. He swallowed hard. I saw Mrs. Marchmont at the French windows. She appeared to be writing something. I didn't wish to disturb her, so I continued toward the yew hedge. Poirot leaned forward with interest. You observed her writing, Monsieur Avery. You are certain? Quite certain. She was seated at the small writing table, pen in hand. She seemed concentrated, absorbed in whatever she was composing. And then, Graves prompted. I walked for perhaps 20 minutes. When I was returning to the house, I heard voices from that direction, 2 people in conversation near the sitting-room windows, a man and woman speaking in low tones, though I couldn't distinguish the words. This revelation caused a visible stir. Graves made careful notes, while Poirot's green eyes sharpened with unmistakable interest. The time of these voices? Perhaps 25 minutes past 4. The conversation was brief, no more than a few minutes. Then silence. You could not identify the speakers. Avery shook his head miserably. They were too distant and speaking quietly. I assumed it was merely guests seeking privacy away from the crowd. When Avery departed, visibly shaken, Lady Hartington was summoned. She entered with her chin raised defiantly, though her hands trembled as she arranged her skirts. Lady Hartington, Graves began gently, I must ask about Mrs. Marchmont's state of mind recently. Had she seemed troubled about anything? Well, Lady Hartington hesitated, glancing toward the door as though fearing eavesdroppers. There had been some unpleasantness. Nothing serious, you understand. But Evelyn had been receiving some rather disagreeable correspondence. What sort of correspondence? Anonymous letters, she admitted reluctantly. Quite distressing things. Evelyn destroyed them immediately. She said dwelling on such poison would only give it power, but I could see they upset her greatly. Poirot's head tilted with the alertness of a bird detecting movement. Anonymous letters, madame? Of what nature? Dreadful accusations about Geoffrey's death. Someone seemed to harbour ill feelings about the whole Constantinople affair, the sort of vicious gossip one expects from the gutter press, not from private correspondence. How long had she been receiving these letters? Several weeks. They came irregularly, sometimes 2 in a week, sometimes none for days, always in the same hand, always unsigned. Lady Hartington's voice dropped to a whisper. She said someone was trying to drive her mad with guilt over something that wasn't her fault. Graves exchanged a meaningful glance with Poirot. Did she have any suspicions about who might be sending them? She never said. But I noticed she became very careful about her mail, always collecting it herself, never leaving letters lying about. It was as though she feared someone in the house might— She trailed off, horrified by her own implication. When Lady Hartington was dismissed, Graves turned to Poirot with evident frustration. Anonymous letters, overheard conversations, financial disputes. We have motives aplenty, but no clear suspect. Au contraire, mon ami, Poirot replied thoughtfully. We have something far more valuable than suspects. We have the psychology of fear. Someone in this house knew that Evelyn Marchmont was becoming dangerous enough to require silencing. The question is not who had opportunity, but who had the most compelling need to ensure her silence became permanent. Through the window, I could see Sir Alistair Brooke pacing the terrace, his distinguished bearing marred by obvious agitation. Whatever secrets lay buried in the Constantinople affair, it seemed they had followed Evelyn Marchmont to her final resting place at Hartington Court. The woman who didn't stay dead had carried with her more than memories. She had carried the power to destroy reputations, and someone had killed to prevent that power from being used. Sir Alistair Brooke entered the morning room with the measured precision of a man accustomed to diplomatic corridors and confidential memoranda. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, his bearing erect despite his 60-odd years, and his pale eyes held the particular opacity I had learned to associate with the Foreign Office. "Inspector Graves," he said, inclining his head with chilly courtesy, "you will understand that I am here as a private guest. Nothing concerning Mr. Geoffrey Marchmont's service abroad falls within your jurisdiction." Graves regarded him steadily. "At present, Sir Alistair, my jurisdiction includes anything that might have led someone to shoot Mrs. Marchmont through the heart. If that touches on government business, then government business has come to Surrey." A faint smile touched Poirot's lips at this exchange. Sir Alistair's expression, however, remained impassive. "Very well. What do you require?" "Your movements this afternoon, particularly between 4 o'clock and the discovery of the body." "I was on the main terrace, discussing embassy staffing matters with young Hartington. Later I conversed with Monsieur Poirot about various topics. We were in full view of other guests throughout." Poirot nodded confirmation. "That is correct, Inspector. Sir Alistair and I spoke from approximately 4:20 until the alarm was raised." "And before 4:20, Graves pressed, "I was walking alone in the rose garden, considering some cables received this morning. I cannot specify the exact minutes." Poirot leaned forward with quiet intensity. "You knew Geoffrey Marchmont well, Sir Alistair. As well as one knows any promising member of the service. His death was regrettable. A tragic accident on those treacherous embassy stairs. His widow, however, had questions about this accident, did she not?" Sir Alistair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Marchmont had developed certain theories. Grief can sometimes manifest in unfortunate ways. She requested access to her husband's personal effects. Letters, notebooks, a dispatch case, all routine materials, I assured her. Yet she persisted in her inquiries. She had become somewhat obsessed with the notion that Geoffrey's death was not accidental. Complete nonsense, naturally, but she threatened to make her suspicions public unless given full access to his papers. When Sir Alistair departed, bristling with suppressed indignation, Graves turned to Poirot with evident frustration. These Foreign Office types treat murder as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a crime to be solved. "They are trained to protect secrets, mon ami," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "But secrets, like pressure in a kettle, must eventually find release." Evening had settled over Hartington Court by the time the interviews concluded. Dinner was a subdued affair, the usual country house chatter replaced by nervous whispers and meaningful glances. Lady Hartington maintained her composure with visible effort, while Rupert sat rigidly upright, barely touching his food. Duncan Avery appeared particularly agitated, his scholarly composure entirely abandoned. After dinner, the company gathered reluctantly in the drawing-room. Poirot positioned himself near the fire, observing the psychological currents that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation. "A most illuminating day," he murmured to me. The anonymous letters, the Foreign Office connection, the overheard conversation, each piece of the puzzle reveals another layer of complexity. Our quiet discussion was interrupted by Rupert Hartington, who approached with obvious agitation. "Monsieur Poirot, I've been considering what Duncan Avery claimed about those voices he heard. It troubles me greatly." "In what way, Monsieur Rupert?" "The timing is wrong. Avery said he heard a man and woman conversing near the sitting room around 4:25, but I was with Sir Alistair on the main terrace at precisely that time. I checked my watch when we discussed the embassy matters. It was exactly 4:30. Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "You are certain of this timing?" "Absolutely. And furthermore, I distinctly remember seeing Avery himself near the yew hedge around that time, behaving rather furtively. If he was close enough to overhear conversation, he was certainly close enough to—" Rupert's voice trailed off as the implications became clear. "To be one of the speakers himself," Poirot finished quietly. Across the room, Duncan Avery sat hunched in his chair, staring into the fire with haunted eyes. His hands trembled as he reached for his brandy glass, and perspiration beaded his forehead despite the evening's coolness. "The psychology of guilt," Poirot observed softly. "It writes itself upon the human countenance more clearly than any signature. Our scholarly friend carries a burden that grows heavier with each passing hour. The first false lead was taking shape before our eyes. Duncan Avery, the mild-mannered historian, now appeared uncomfortably close to the scene of the crime, his account of overheard voices suddenly suspect. The woman who didn't stay dead had, in her final moments, set in motion a chain of revelations that would soon expose the truth hidden beneath Hartington Court's genteel facade. The psychological game had begun in earnest. The grey morning light that filtered through the windows of Hartington Court seemed to drain the colour from everything it touched, leaving the once cheerful rooms looking wan and subdued. Breakfast was a strained affair, with conversation reduced to whispered exchanges and the occasional clink of china. The shadow of Evelyn Marchmont's death hung over the house like a pall, and I noticed that Duncan Avery was conspicuously absent from the morning table. Inspector Graves had arrived early, his methodical nature evident in the way he arranged his papers and consulted his notebook. When he requested that Avery join him once more in the morning room, there was a new edge to his manner that suggested the investigation had taken a more serious turn. Avery appeared looking haggard, his scholarly composure entirely abandoned. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled as he took his seat. The transformation from the mild-mannered historian of 2 days ago was striking and deeply unsettling. "Mr. Avery," Graves began without preamble, "I've had time to consider your account of yesterday's events, and I find several aspects troubling. You claim to have overheard a conversation between a man and woman near the blue sitting room, yet Mr. Hartington insists he saw you by the yew hedge at precisely the time you describe, behaving in what he termed a furtive manner." Avery's face went pale. "Rupert may have been mistaken about the time. These things happen when one is distracted by social obligations." Poirot, who had been observing from his position near the window, stepped forward with his characteristic precision. "Monsieur Avery, the psychology of memory is most fascinating, is it not? Under stress, the mind sometimes creates what it believes should have happened, rather than recording what actually occurred." "I don't understand what you're implying," Avery said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I am implying nothing," Poirot replied gently. "I'm merely observing that your account has certain inconsistencies that suggest a mind under considerable strain." At that moment, Mrs. Green, the housekeeper, appeared at the door with a worried expression. "Inspector, forgive the interruption, but there's something about yesterday's post that I think you should know." Graves motioned her forward. "What is it, Mrs. Green?" "The second post, sir." It comes regular at 4 o'clock, but with all the commotion yesterday, the letters were left in the back hall. We found them this morning." She held out a small bundle of envelopes. "One of them is addressed to Mrs. Marchmont." The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Graves took the letters, sorting through them until he found the one bearing Evelyn Marchmont's name. The handwriting was bold and masculine, quite different from the careful script one might expect from anonymous correspondence. "Posted yesterday morning," Graves observed, examining the postmark. "She would have received this shortly before her death." Poirot moved closer, his green eyes bright with interest. "With your permission, Inspector?" Graves handed him the envelope. Poirot studied it with the intensity of a scholar examining a rare manuscript, noting the quality of the paper, the confident strokes of the pen, the slight pressure variations that spoke of habitual authority. "This is not the hand of someone accustomed to anonymity," he murmured. "The writer expects to be obeyed." Graves slit open the envelope and extracted a single sheet of expensive notepaper. His eyes moved rapidly over the contents, his expression growing increasingly grave. "It appears," he said slowly, "that Mrs. Marchmont was summoned to a meeting. The writer claims to possess information about her husband's death that would be of vital interest to her. However, he also warns her against making any precipitous revelations that might prove embarrassing to certain parties." "A meeting," I interjected, "but she was killed in her own sitting room." "The letter suggests the writer intended to come to her," Graves continued. "It's signed simply a friend, but the tone is hardly friendly, more like a veiled threat." During this exchange, I'd been watching Duncan Avery, and what I saw alarmed me greatly. His face had gone from pale to ashen, and he was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles showed white. "Mr. Avery," Poirot said quietly, "you appear distressed by this revelation. Perhaps you have something to add to your previous account?" Avery's composure finally cracked entirely. There's something I haven't told you. About yesterday afternoon. About Mrs. Marchmont." Graves leaned forward intently. "Go on." "She did ask me to help her with something. Not just casual conversation. She was writing a letter. A very important letter. She said she had finally gathered enough evidence to prove that Geoffrey's death wasn't accidental." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Poirot's expression remained neutral, but I could see the sharp intelligence working behind his eyes. "Evidence, Monsieur Avery." "What sort of evidence?" "Discrepancies in the official reports. Dates that didn't match. Geoffrey's last dispatches suggested he was investigating something sensitive, something that might have made him dangerous to certain people." Avery's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She was writing to the Prime Minister, demanding a full inquiry." "And you helped her with this letter?" Graves asked. "I verified some historical details for her. Dates, political circumstances in Constantinople at the time. She was so determined, so convinced she was close to the truth." Avery buried his face in his hands. "I tried to dissuade her. I told her the forces she was dealing with were too powerful, too dangerous." "Yet she persisted," Poirot observed. "Yes. She said she owed it to Geoffrey's memory, that she couldn't let his murderers go unpunished." Avery looked up, his eyes haunted. "I left her there, writing that letter. When I returned from my walk, she was dead." "And the voices you claim to overhear?" Graves pressed. Avery's shoulders sagged in defeat. "There were no voices. I fabricated that story because I panicked. I heard something, a sound like a door closing or perhaps a muffled shot, and I was terrified. I thought if I could create the impression that someone else was there, it might deflect suspicion from me." The confession hung heavy in the morning air. Here was the partial truth at last. Avery's proximity to the crime, his knowledge of Evelyn's dangerous investigation, his deliberate deception of the police. Yet even as he spoke, I sensed that Poirot was not entirely satisfied with this revelation. "The psychology of fear," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. It drives men to create elaborate fictions rather than face simple truths. But sometimes, mon ami, the fiction reveals more than the intended truth. Graves was already making notes, his expression grim. Mr. Avery, you understand that your admission places you in a very serious position. You were present at the scene. You had knowledge of Mrs. Marchmont's activities that might have endangered powerful people, and you deliberately misled the police investigation. I didn't kill her, Avery cried desperately. I was trying to protect her. I knew what she was up against, the kind of people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. And yet, Poirot said thoughtfully, someone did stop her. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing, exactly when she would be vulnerable, exactly how to ensure her silence would be permanent. The implications were clear and chilling. The woman who didn't stay dead had been silenced not by a crime of passion, but by a calculated act of murder designed to look like something else entirely. And Duncan Avery, whether guilty or innocent, had walked directly into the trap that had been prepared for him. As Graves prepared to take Avery into custody for further questioning, I caught Poirot's eye. His expression was troubled, and I knew that despite Avery's confession, my friend's remarkable mind was still working, still seeking the psychological truth that lay beneath the surface of apparent facts. The first false lead was taking shape before our eyes, but I suspected that Hercule Poirot was far from convinced that they had found their true quarry. The arrest of Duncan Avery seemed to settle over Hartington Court, like a blanket thrown over a disturbed nest of wasps, bringing temporary quiet, but not true peace. Inspector Graves departed with his prisoner, leaving behind a household that breathed more easily, yet somehow felt no lighter for the apparent resolution of their troubles. Lady Hartington, who had maintained her composure through sheer force of aristocratic will, now allowed herself the luxury of visible relief. She moved through her drawing room, accepting condolences from the remaining guests, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while murmuring appropriate phrases about poor Duncan and one never knows what lurks in the human heart. Rupert Hartington stood by the morning room window, watching the police car disappear down the gravel drive. His shoulders finally relaxed for the first time since the tragedy began. "Thank God it's over," he said to Sir Alistair Brooke, who had remained to assist with any official complications. "Mother can begin to recover from this nightmare." Yet as I observed the scene from my position near the fireplace, I noticed that Hercule Poirot did not share in the general sense of resolution. He stood apart from the others, his green eyes thoughtful, his neat figure radiating the particular tension I had learned to associate with his deepest cogitations. Poirot's psychological doubts. "You are not satisfied, mon ami?" I asked quietly, joining him in his solitary observation. "Satisfied?" Poirot's voice was barely above a murmur. "Mon Dieu, Hastings, I am profoundly dissatisfied. This solution, it is too neat, too convenient. Our good Inspector Graves has a suspect who has lied, a man with knowledge, with proximity to the crime. It is enough for him to feel that he advances. But the psychology does not accord. But Avery's confession explains his presence, his deception, his knowledge of Madame Marchmont's activities. What it does not explain is the nature of the crime itself." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he studied the relieved faces around us. "You employ the language of the official police, Hastings. Motive, opportunity. They are necessary, yes, but they are not sufficient. We must also have the character. Does it fit? Is it congruous with the man?" He adjusted his cuffs, a sure sign of inner perturbation. "I think Monsieur Avery is capable of many weaknesses, of cowardice, of evasion, of the small deceits of the timid soul. But to plan, to execute with the cold blood, cela non. His fear is there, yes, but it is not the fear of the murderer. It is the fear of the man who has been close to something he does not fully understand." The missing weapon. Before I could reply, Mrs. Green appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. Excuse me, gentlemen, but Inspector Graves telephoned. There's been a development. They've searched Mr. Avery's room thoroughly, and they cannot find the murder weapon. This revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Sir Alister's carefully maintained diplomatic composure slipped for just an instant, revealing something that might have been alarm beneath the official mask. Surely the weapon was disposed of, Rupert suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Thrown in the pond, perhaps, or hidden somewhere in the grounds. Perhaps, Poirot agreed, his tone deceptively mild. Or perhaps the weapon was never in Monsieur Avery's possession at all. There is another possibility, that Monsieur Avery, in his panic and guilt, has confessed to a crime he did not commit, while the true murderer remains among us, watching with satisfaction as an innocent man takes the blame. Testing, Sir Alister. Sir Alister approached us then, his diplomatic smile firmly in place, though I detected a subtle tension in his bearing. Monsieur Poirot, I must congratulate you on your assistance in this unfortunate matter. The Foreign Office is grateful that such a delicate situation has been resolved so expeditiously. You consider the matter resolved, Sir Alister? Poirot's tone remained deceptively mild. Certainly. The evidence against Avery is quite conclusive. But evidence and truth, they are not always the same thing, are they? Poirot's smile was equally diplomatic, but there was steel beneath the silk. Tell me, Sir Alister, this letter that Madame Marchmont was writing to the Prime Minister, you would not by any chance have known of its contents beforehand? Sir Alister's pale eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. I fail to see how I could have possessed such knowledge. Indeed. Yet you spoke yesterday of her theories about her husband's death, her threats to make her suspicions public. One might wonder how you came to be so well informed about the private thoughts of a grieving widow. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Marchmont had made her suspicions known to various parties, Sir Alister said carefully. In her grief, she was not always discreet about her accusations. Wild theories about Geoffrey's death, he continued, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of official denial. She seemed to believe that certain sensitive negotiations in Constantinople had made him a target for assassination. Complete nonsense, naturally, but potentially embarrassing if given public credence. Lady Hartington's revelation. At that moment, Lady Hartington approached us with obvious agitation, having overheard the latter part of our conversation. Monsieur Poirot, may I speak with you privately, if you please? When I made to withdraw, Poirot gestured for me to remain. Captain Hastings is entirely discreet, Lady Hartington. What you say to me, you may say equally to him. She took a seat with a weary air, her usual commanding presence subdued by the weight of recent events. I cannot tell you how this business with Mr. Avery distresses me, but I wanted to tell you, before the police fix upon the wrong person, that there is more to Evelyn's situation than has yet come out. You are very wise, Lady Hartington, said Poirot gravely. When death has come, the fear of scandal should give place to the fear of injustice. What have you to tell us? She folded her hands tightly in her lap. Evelyn had been under pressure, not only from those anonymous letters, but from another source entirely. She had a visitor last week, a man. He came quite late in the evening after dinner. I happened to encounter him in the corridor as he was leaving. Ah, Poirot leaned forward with keen interest. And what manner of man was this visitor? Tall, well-dressed, about 40, I should say. Dark hair going thin. The sort of man one sees everywhere and remembers nowhere. But he carried himself with a certain self-assurance, the confidence of authority. She paused, her voice dropping. I overheard part of their conversation. Voices raised, then lowered again. I distinctly heard Evelyn say, "You underestimate me if you think I can be frightened." And his reply, something about ruin and "no one will believe you now." The deeper conspiracy. Poirot's finger tapped thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. Self-assurance, threats of ruin, the late-night visit, and Madame Marchmont did not after this abandon her investigations. On the contrary, she seemed more determined. She spent more time in the library with Mr. Avery, researching Geoffrey's papers. She even mentioned finding something in his historical notes, something about a network of foreign agents operating within the diplomatic corps. Sir Alistair had gone very pale during this recitation, though he maintained his official composure. "Lady Hartington, I must caution you against repeating such inflammatory speculation. These matters touch on national security." "These matters," Poirot interrupted quietly, "touch on murder. And murder, Sir Alistair, recognizes no diplomatic immunity." The psychological game had begun in earnest. Poirot was no longer content to observe and deduce. He was actively probing, testing reactions, watching for the telltale signs that would reveal the truth beneath carefully constructed lies. "Until I know otherwise," Poirot continued, his gaze moving deliberately from Sir Alistair to the other guests, "I must assume the real danger still walks among us. Therefore, I entreat you all, be cautious. A cornered animal is dangerous, but a cornered murderer who reasons and calculates is more dangerous still. If he fears discovery, he may seek to remove anyone who threatens him." As I watched Sir Alistair struggle to maintain his composure under Poirot's penetrating gaze, I began to understand that the woman who didn't stay dead had indeed been silenced by someone with far more to lose than a mild-mannered historian. Someone whose secrets were worth killing to protect, and who possessed both the nerve and the resources to ensure that an innocent man would pay the price for their crime. The game of psychological chess had begun, and I could see that Hercule Poirot was already several moves ahead of his opponent. The following morning dawned grey and oppressive, as though the very atmosphere of Hartington Court had absorbed the malevolent presence that moved among its inhabitants. Poirot, showing no inclination to wait passively for Inspector Graves' return, requested access to the blue sitting room for what he termed a consultation with the scene itself. Poirot's crime scene analysis. "To understand the psychology of murder, Hastings," he explained as we entered the restored room, "one must first understand the psychology of the moment. Not merely what happened, but how it felt to happen." He moved about the space with his characteristic precision, hands clasped behind his back, his green eyes taking in details that seemed to speak to him in a language only he could interpret. The writing table drew his particular attention, and he studied it as one might regard an unreliable witness. "Observe the chair, mon ami," he said, touching its back lightly. "It is turned aside, not pushed back in. Alarm. The pen lies unkept beside the inkwell, abandoned mid-sentence, not carefully set aside. This was not a woman preparing for an expected visitor, but one interrupted in urgent work." He crossed to the French windows, unlatching them to step onto the side lawn. The shrubs here formed a natural screen, effectively concealing the room from the main party. "One might approach very close indeed before being observed," he murmured, studying the gravel path that led around the house. Especially if one chose a moment when attention was focused elsewhere. The arrival of some notable guest, perhaps, or a particularly engaging conversation on the terrace. Lady Hartington's revelations. Our examination was interrupted by Lady Hartington herself, who appeared in the doorway with obvious reluctance. "I find I cannot stay away from this room," she confessed, her usual commanding presence subdued. "It draws me like a recurring nightmare." "Your presence is most opportune, Lady Hartington," Poirot replied. "There are certain details that only you might clarify. Tell me, without seeking to organize your thoughts, what impressions remain strongest from yesterday afternoon?" She frowned, considering. "The heat, for one thing. Unusually warm for the season. Sir Alistair was particularly irritable about some communication he had received. He and Rupert had rather sharp words about Geoffrey's name appearing in the newspapers again." "Ah." Poirot's tone sharpened with interest. "The usual disagreement. Sir Alistair insisting that Evelyn's inquiries were damaging Geoffrey's reputation, Rupert maintaining she had every right to seek the truth. But Sir Alistair seemed genuinely agitated, kept glancing about as though fearing eavesdroppers. And in the days preceding the party, did your household staff notice any unfamiliar persons about the grounds? Lady Hartington looked startled. Now that you mention it, yes. Mrs. Green remarked on a flower vendor she didn't recognize, and there was a substitute chauffeur from the hire firm. Our regular man was indisposed. The timing discrepancy. When Lady Hartington departed, I found Poirot deep in thought, his finger tapping against his lower lip, a sure sign of mental calculation. The chronology troubles me, Hastings, he said suddenly. Young Rupert was quite specific about seeing Avery near the yew hedge at 4:30. He checked his watch when discussing embassy matters with Sir Alistair. Yet the maid, Mary, reported seeing Madame Marchmont alive at 4:30, saying she needed to collect her letters. So there's a contradiction in the timing. A profound one. If Madame Marchmont was alive at 4:30, awaiting her post, she could not have been shot at 4:25 as the original timeline suggested. Either someone has made an error in their recollection, or, he paused meaningfully, or we have been deliberately misled about the sequence of events. Physical evidence. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, the under-gardener, whom Poirot had summoned to discuss the grounds near the sitting-room. You mentioned some disturbance to the flower-beds, Thomas? The young man nodded earnestly. Aye, sir. Someone had been trampling the delphiniums near the French windows, and there was a footprint in the soft earth. Not a regular shoe, mind you, more like a heavy boot with a distinctive tread. Poirot's eyebrows rose with unmistakable interest. A boot, you say? And you tidied this away? Had to, sir. Couldn't have Lady Hartington seeing the mess. You did quite right, Thomas. This boot print, could you describe the pattern? Deep ridges, sir, like what you'd see on a walking boot or perhaps a military issue. Not the sort of footwear one expects at a garden party. The second crime. It was at that moment that Inspector Graves arrived, his usually composed demeanor shattered by obvious agitation. His news struck the household like a physical blow. Avery's been attacked, he announced without preamble. Found unconscious in his cell this morning, badly beaten. Someone pinned a note to his chest. Silence is golden. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Lady Hartington went pale, while the few remaining guests who had gathered in the drawing-room exchanged alarmed glances. This changes everything, Graves continued grimly. It confirms what you suspected, Monsieur Poirot. Avery was never our killer. Someone wanted him silenced, permanently. Indeed, Inspector, Poirot replied, his voice unusually grave. It confirms that our true culprit is not merely cunning, but utterly ruthless. The psychology of the cornered animal, as I have said, when threatened with exposure, it becomes infinitely more dangerous. New evidence emerges. Mrs. Green appeared at that moment, wringing her hands with obvious distress. Inspector, there's something I should have mentioned yesterday, but with all the confusion. The telephone rang twice during the party, both times asking specifically for Mrs. Marchmont. Very insistent the caller was. Said it was urgent. The voice. Was it familiar? Poirot inquired. It seemed so, sir, though I couldn't place it. A gentleman's voice, well educated, but strained, as though the speaker were under considerable pressure. Graves made careful notes while Poirot's eyes narrowed with concentration. The timing of these calls, Mrs. Green? The first around 4 o'clock, the second perhaps 20 minutes later. Both times I couldn't locate Mrs. Marchmont to deliver the message. Poirot's strategic analysis. When the others had departed, Poirot turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. The pattern emerges, Hastings. Our murderer is revealed, not by what he has done, but by what he continues to do. The attack on Avery demonstrates desperation, a calculated risk taken to ensure silence. But who, Poirot? The evidence seems to point in multiple directions. That, mon ami, is precisely the intention. Our killer is sophisticated, methodical. He has created a web of misdirection designed to confuse and delay. But every lie contains within it the seeds of truth, and every deception reveals the psychology of the deceiver. He moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful Surrey countryside that masked such deadly secrets. The time has come to apply pressure, Hastings, to test the reactions of those who remain. For I begin to see the shape of this conspiracy. It reaches far beyond a simple domestic murder. The woman who didn't stay dead was killed not for what she knew, but for what she was about to reveal, and that revelation would have destroyed more than one carefully constructed life. The psychological game was entering its most dangerous phase. Somewhere in that elegant house, a murderer waited and watched, believing himself safe behind his carefully constructed facade. But Hercule Poirot was preparing to strip away those protective layers, one by one, until the naked truth stood revealed in all its terrible clarity. The attack on Duncan Avery had been intended to close one avenue of investigation, but instead it had opened another, one that led directly to the heart of a conspiracy that stretched from the drawing rooms of Surrey to the diplomatic corridors of Whitehall itself. The storm that had been gathering all day finally broke that evening, as though the atmosphere itself could no longer bear the accumulating tension within Hartington Court. Rain lashed against the tall windows, and wind rattled the panes, drowning the usual country sounds under its relentless assault. In the drawing-room, the fire had been built up to combat the chill, casting uneasy shadows that seemed to flicker in time with the unspoken fears of the occupants. Poirot's formal gathering. By prior arrangement with Inspector Graves, who remained in London coordinating the investigation into Avery's attack, Poirot had requested the presence of the principal members of the household for what he termed a methodical examination of certain psychological and physical evidence. Lady Hartington, Rupert, Sir Alistair Brooke, Mrs. Green and the vicar were present, their faces reflecting varying degrees of unease as my friend positioned himself before the fireplace with his customary theatrical precision. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying quiet authority, "we find ourselves confronted not merely with a single act of violence, but with a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation and murder. The attack upon Monsieur Avery confirms what I have long suspected, that we are dealing with a killer of exceptional cunning and ruthlessness." Sir Alistair, who had been studying the evening paper with apparent absorption, looked up with carefully controlled irritation. "Monsieur Poirot, surely this theatrical gathering is unnecessary. Inspector Graves has made his arrest, and while the attack on Avery is regrettable, it doesn't alter the fundamental facts of the case." "On the contrary, Sir Alistair," Poirot replied smoothly, "it alters everything. The attempt to silence Monsieur Avery demonstrates that someone still fears what he might reveal. That fear, mes amis, is the key to understanding not only who killed Evelyn Marchmont, but why her death was necessary. The physical evidence." Poirot moved to the side table, where he had arranged several items with his characteristic precision. "Let us begin with the physical evidence, which tells its own story to those who know how to interpret it. Thomas, our under-gardener, discovered a boot print in the soft earth near the French windows. Not the light shoes of a garden party guest, but a heavy walking boot with distinctive ridged soles." He paused, allowing this information to settle. "This suggests someone who either arrived prepared for an unscheduled departure across rough ground, or whose normal attire included such practical footwear. More significantly, it indicates premeditation. The killer came equipped for the task ahead." Rupert shifted uncomfortably. "But surely any number of people might wear such boots. The gardening staff, delivery men, even guests who preferred practical footwear." "Indeed," Poirot agreed. But when we consider this evidence alongside the timeline discrepancies we have discovered, a pattern emerges. You were most specific, Monsieur Rupert, about checking your watch at precisely 4:30 when discussing embassy matters with Sir Alistair. Yet the maid Mary reported seeing Madame Marchmont alive at that same time, awaiting her letters. The dramatic revelation. Poirot reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. This morning, while conducting a more thorough examination of the blue sitting room, I discovered something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. He unwrapped the object with deliberate ceremony, revealing a gold cufflink with distinctive blue enamel monogramming. The initials are AB, and the craftsmanship is exceptional. These particular cufflinks were made by Aspreys of Bond Street to a design commissioned exclusively by the Foreign Office for presentation to senior diplomatic personnel. According to their records, only 12 pairs were ever created. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Sir Alistair's hand moved instinctively toward his sleeve, then stopped as he realized the gesture's significance. His carefully maintained diplomatic composure showed the first genuine crack I had observed. "Such items are hardly unique," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Many gentlemen possess similar accessories." "Perhaps," Poirot conceded pleasantly, "but when we combine this physical evidence with other curious facts that have emerged, the picture becomes quite clear." Mrs. Green's testimony. At that moment, as though summoned by Poirot's words, Mrs. Green stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Monsieur Poirot asked me to think carefully about the telephone calls yesterday," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The second call, the one around 4:20, I've remembered where I heard that voice before. It was the same gentleman who visited Mrs. Marchmont last week, the one who came late at night and spoke so urgently with her." Lady Hartington leaned forward with sudden interest. "The mysterious visitor I mentioned. You recognized his voice?" "Yes, my lady. Very agitated he was on the telephone, asking most insistently to speak with Mrs. Marchmont. And when he visited last week, I heard him say quite clearly, 'You must reconsider, Evelyn. This will ruin everything.'" The psychological profile. Poirot nodded gravely. "We begin to see the psychology of our killer, n'est-ce pas? A man accustomed to authority, to being obeyed. A man whose entire carefully constructed world was threatened by one woman's determination to uncover the truth about her husband's death." He began to pace slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in his characteristic manner. The anonymous letters, the late-night visit, the threatening telephone calls, all failed to dissuade Madame Marchmont from her course. She was writing to the Prime Minister, you see, with evidence that would have exposed not merely a single death in Constantinople, but an entire network of corruption within the diplomatic service. Sir Alistair had gone very pale, but his training in crisis management reasserted itself. "These are serious allegations, Monsieur Poirot. I trust you have concrete evidence to support such dramatic claims." "The evidence," Poirot replied quietly, "was in the letter Madame Marchmont was writing when she died. The letter that has mysteriously disappeared from the scene of the crime. Someone removed it very carefully after her death. Someone who knew exactly what it contained and could not afford to let it reach its intended destination." The tightening net. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as though nature itself were responding to the mounting tension within the room. Sir Alistair stood by the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the lightning-split sky, his diplomatic mask finally beginning to show serious cracks. "You speak of networks and conspiracies," he said, his voice carefully controlled but lacking its earlier confidence. "Such matters are highly sensitive. National security concerns often require—" "They require murder," Poirot interrupted softly. "They require the silencing of an innocent woman whose only crime was loving her husband enough to seek justice for his death. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Around the room, faces showed varying degrees of shock, comprehension, and fear. The psychological game had reached its crucial phase, and I could see that Poirot was preparing to apply the final pressure that would force the truth into the open. "The person who now possesses Evelyn Marchmont's letter," Poirot continued relentlessly, "holds in his hands not only her final testament, but also the instrument of his own destruction. That fear, mes amis, will drive him to increasingly desperate acts. It has already driven him to attempt the murder of an innocent man in police custody." As the storm raged with renewed fury outside, I realized that we had reached the moment of maximum danger. The killer was cornered, exposed, and desperate. The woman who didn't stay dead had become, in death, more powerful than she had ever been in life. A silent accuser whose unfinished letter had turned Hartington Court into a battleground between justice and survival. The final confrontation was at hand, and I could only pray that Poirot's remarkable mind had anticipated every move in this deadly game of psychological chess. The storm had spent most of its fury by the following morning, leaving behind a washed, glistening world and an atmosphere inside Hartington Court as brittle as spun glass. The very air seemed to hold its breath, as though the house itself awaited the final resolution of the tragedy that had shattered its genteel tranquility. Poirot appeared as calm and self-possessed as ever, eating his breakfast with evident enjoyment and straightening his napkin with mathematical precision. Yet I detected beneath his composed exterior the particular tension that preceded his most dramatic revelations. "It is time, Hastings," he said simply, rising with an air of quiet purpose, "for the endgame. But first, I must speak alone with Monsieur Rupert." The questioning of Rupert. Rupert Hartington joined us in the small morning room a quarter of an hour later, looking tired and strained, but with a new alertness in his eyes. The wariness of someone who had begun to suspect that events might be escaping his control. "You wanted to see me, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes, Monsieur Rupert." "Pray be seated. There are one or two small points that trouble me." Poirot's tone was almost conversational. "You're a man of exact habits, are you not? You check your watch, you note times, you pride yourself on punctuality." "I suppose so. It is a professional necessity in my line of work." "Just so. And yet," Poirot tilted his head thoughtfully, "on the afternoon of Madame Marchmont's death, your recollection of certain times has been extremely precise in one respect and strangely vague in another. You remember checking your watch at exactly 4:30 during your conversation with Sir Alistair, yet you are less sure about when you last saw your sister-in-law alive. A curious inconsistency, n'est-ce pas?" Rupert shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see that it signifies. One remembers what one happens to notice." "Exactly," Poirot agreed gently. "One remembers what one chooses to notice, and sometimes one remembers a time too precisely, because it is convenient to do so. Tell me, Monsieur Rupert, you knew about the letter Evelyn was writing to the Prime Minister, did you not?" The direct question struck home. Rupert's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "Duncan told me, in confidence, that she was planning some mad appeal. I confronted her. She refused to listen. She said truth mattered more than careers." "And did you share this information with Sir Alistair?" Rupert hesitated fractionally. He already suspected something of the kind. The Foreign Office isn't blind, Monsieur Poirot. When a diplomat's widow starts asking too many questions, word gets around. When Rupert departed, visibly shaken, Poirot turned to me with grim satisfaction. "Monsieur Rupert is weak, fearful of scandal, yes, but he lacks the steel for murder. Yet he has been an instrument, and that is nearly as dangerous. An instrument of someone more clever, more ruthless, more accustomed to manipulating men and events." The final gathering. By late afternoon, the household had assembled once more in the drawing room at Poirot's request. The storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy, pressing the light down into a subdued glow that seemed to drain the colour from everything it touched. Sir Alistair Brooke stood by the mantelpiece, as perfectly groomed and composed as if about to attend a diplomatic reception, yet I noticed the slight tightness at the corners of his mouth, the increased stillness in his posture, the subtle signs of a man under enormous strain. Lady Hartington sat rigidly in a straight-backed chair, her hands clenched in her lap. The other occupants of the room, Mrs. Green, the vicar, even Inspector Graves, who had returned from London, all seemed frozen in place, their gazes fixed on Poirot as he positioned himself before the flickering fire. The methodical revelation. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying quiet authority, we find ourselves confronted not merely with a single act of violence, but with a carefully orchestrated campaign that reaches from the drawing-rooms of Surrey to the highest corridors of power in Whitehall itself. He paused, allowing the implications to settle. Geoffrey Marchmont died in Constantinople not because of a tragic accident, but because he had discovered evidence of treason within the diplomatic service, a network of individuals selling state secrets to foreign powers. When his widow began her own investigation and threatened to expose this conspiracy, she too had to be silenced. Sir Alistair's voice cut through the tension, cool and controlled. These are extraordinary allegations, Monsieur Poirot. I trust you have more than speculation to support them. I have the psychology of murder, Sir Alistair. I have the pattern of desperate acts committed by a man whose entire world was crumbling around him. Poirot moved to the side table, where he had arranged several items with characteristic precision. Let us begin with the physical evidence, which tells its own story to those who know how to interpret it. He lifted a small object wrapped in a tissue paper. This morning, while conducting a more thorough examination of the blue sitting room, I discovered something that had been overlooked. He unwrapped it with deliberate ceremony, revealing a gold cufflink with distinctive blue enamel monogramming. The initials are AB, and the craftsmanship is exceptional. These particular cufflinks were made by Aspreys of Bond Street to a design commissioned exclusively by the Foreign Office for presentation to senior diplomatic personnel. The effect was instantaneous. Sir Alistair's hand moved instinctively toward his sleeve, then stopped as he realized the gesture's significance. The psychological analysis. But physical evidence alone does not make a case, Poirot continued. We must also consider the psychology. Who would have the motive to silence Evelyn Marchmont? Not merely someone who wished her dead, but someone who stood to lose everything if her inquiries succeeded. He began to pace slowly before the fireplace. The anonymous letters, the late-night visits, the threatening telephone calls all failed to dissuade Madame Marchmont from her course. She was writing to the Prime Minister with evidence that would have exposed not merely Geoffrey's murder, but an entire network of corruption. From his pocket, Poirot produced a charred fragment of paper. This remnant I discovered in the grate of the small study, torn from a larger document that had not burned completely. The handwriting is Madame Marchmont's. The addressed salutation remains visible. Dear Prime Minister. A collective gasp ran through the room. Careless work for a man of such training, Poirot observed. The rest was burned, yes. But this little remnant escaped, and in escaping, it speaks. The complete accusation. Poirot's green eyes fixed on Sir Alistair with unwavering intensity. You came to Hartington Court yesterday not as a guest, but as a predator. You knew the blue sitting room provided perfect access from the gardens during the party. You telephoned twice to confirm Evelyn's location, then approached through the French windows while she was absorbed in her writing. The boot print in the flower bed, the agitated telephone calls that Mrs. Green recognized, the missing letter that vanished in those crucial minutes after the murder, all point to one conclusion. You are a man trained to think first of documents, of the proper handling of sensitive materials. Even in the presence of death, your instinct was to secure compromising papers. Sir Alistair's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. You go too far, Monsieur Poirot. Do I? Then perhaps you can explain why your voice was recognized by Mrs. Green as the same one that threatened Evelyn with ruin during that late-night visit. The same voice that spoke of no one believing her accusations. The confession. Sir Alister stood silent for a long moment, his tall figure rigid against the window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man who had accepted defeat. Geoffrey Marchmont was an idealistic fool, he said quietly. He discovered that certain information was being passed to German agents, and he refused to understand the complexities of the situation. Sometimes, the security of the realm requires compromises that smaller minds cannot comprehend. Ah, Poirot murmured. So you were not merely covering up treason, you were orchestrating it. I was managing it. Sir Alister's composure finally shattered completely. Controlling the flow of information to serve British interests. Geoffrey threatened to expose the entire operation, to destroy years of careful work that had kept us one step ahead of our enemies. His face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation. Do you think I enjoyed it? Evelyn looked up when I entered that room. She wasn't even surprised. She said, I wondered when you would come, Alister. I suppose there's no other way to end this. She was remarkably composed for a woman facing death. And the attack on Duncan Avery? Inspector Graves interjected grimly. A necessary precaution. He knew too much about Evelyn's research. I arranged for a colleague to ensure his permanent silence. Sir Alister's voice had become eerily calm. History will vindicate my actions. Sometimes one must make difficult choices for the greater good. Justice served. The greater good, Poirot replied with quiet intensity, is never served by murder. It is served by truth, by justice, and by the courage to face the consequences of one's actions. At that moment, 2 constables entered, having been summoned by Inspector Graves. Sir Alister offered no resistance as the handcuffs were applied, maintaining his dignity even in defeat. You played a very dangerous game, Monsieur Poirot, he said as he was led away. And you, Sir Alister, Poirot replied, have played a very final one. As the sound of the police car faded into the storm-lashed night, a profound sense of relief washed over the drawing-room, mingling with the lingering horror of what had been revealed. The woman who didn't stay dead had finally achieved her goal. Not only had her killer been exposed, but the entire network of corruption that had cost her husband his life lay in ruins. The psychological game was over. Truth, however inconvenient and painful, had prevailed. And in the heart of Hartington Court, justice had been served with the meticulous precision that only Hercule Poirot could provide. The silence that followed Sir Alister Brooke's departure was profound and unsettling, broken only by the steady drip of rain against the tall windows of Hartington Court. Lady Hartington sat rigidly in her chair, her usual commanding presence subdued by the weight of revelation, while Rupert stood by the fireplace, his face bearing the marks of a man forced to confront uncomfortable truths about his own complicity. Inspector Graves remained for several hours, coordinating with the metropolitan authorities as the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. The search of Sir Alister's belongings had revealed a cache of documents that painted a damning picture of systematic treachery extending far beyond a single murder in Surrey. The network was extensive, Graves informed us grimly. Bank records, coded correspondence, payments to foreign agents. Mrs. Marchmont's investigation would have exposed not just her husband's murder, but years of systematic betrayal at the highest levels of government. Character resolutions and recovery. News arrived that Duncan Avery was recovering well from his injuries, though the psychological scars would take longer to heal. The knowledge that he had been innocent of murder, guilty only of cowardice and misdirection, provided some comfort, but the young historian would carry the burden of his near-fatal brush with injustice for years to come. Rupert Hartington sought out Poirot privately that evening, his usual composed demeanor cracked by guilt and self-recrimination. I gave him the information. He confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I told Sir Alister about Evelyn's letter to the Prime Minister. I thought he would merely persuade her to abandon her inquiries. I never imagined he would resort to murder." Poirot regarded him with characteristic penetration, but not unkindness. "You are guilty of weakness, Monsieur Rupert, and of preferring comfortable lies to disturbing truths. But you are not guilty of murder. The distinction may not comfort you now, but it is a distinction nonetheless." The broader implications. The political ramifications were immediate and far-reaching. Poirot had already dispatched a detailed letter to the Prime Minister, outlining the full extent of the conspiracy that Sir Alister had both protected and exploited. The Foreign Office would face months of investigation and restructuring as the true scope of the betrayal became clear. Geoffrey Marchmont died because he recognized corruption and refused to remain silent. Poirot observed to Lady Hartington as they stood in the blue sitting room, now restored to its former order, but forever changed by the violence it had witnessed. His widow died because she inherited his courage and his determination to see justice done. They were both idealists in the finest sense of that much-maligned word. Poirot's philosophical reflections. As we prepared to depart Hartington Court the following morning, Poirot paused in his methodical packing to share his reflections on the case that had so dramatically disrupted the peaceful Surrey countryside. "The psychology of this crime, Hastings, reveals much about human nature. Sir Alister believed himself a patriot, serving his country through necessary compromises, but the line between compromise and corruption is thinner than most men realize, and once crossed, it becomes invisible to the one who has transgressed it." He adjusted his cuffs with characteristic precision. Evelyn Marchmont possessed something far rarer than beauty or wealth. She possessed moral courage, the courage to pursue truth even when it threatened her comfort, her safety, her very life. That courage, mon ami, is what ultimately destroyed her killer. The classic departure. Lady Hartington insisted on seeing us off personally, her gratitude evident despite her exhaustion. "You have given us justice, Monsieur Poirot," she said simply, "and you have prevented a terrible injustice from being perpetrated upon an innocent man." "Justice, madame, has its own momentum," Poirot replied with quiet satisfaction. "Truth, like water, will always find its way through the smallest crack in any wall built to contain it." As our car pulled away from Hartington Court, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary events we had witnessed. What had begun as a simple country house murder had revealed layers of conspiracy, reaching to the highest corridors of power. "The woman who didn't stay dead," I mused aloud. "Ah, but she did stay dead, Hastings," Poirot corrected gently. "It was her voice that remained alive. Her determination to see justice done, her refusal to let her husband's death go unavenged. Even in death she continued to fight, and in the end, she won." Final thematic resolution. The case was closed, but its implications would resonate for years to come. The diplomatic scandal would lead to significant reforms, other conspirators would be exposed, and the network of corruption that had cost Geoffrey Marchmont his life lay in ruins. In death, Evelyn Marchmont had achieved what she could not accomplish in life: complete vindication for her husband and the destruction of those who had killed him. The woman who didn't stay dead had found her ultimate victory, proving that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks from beyond the grave. As we returned to the familiar comforts of London, Poirot settled back with evident satisfaction. "Another case closed, mon ami. Order restored from chaos. Truth extracted from deception. It is, I think, a good day's work." The psychological game was over. Justice, however delayed, had prevailed.